Hi, my name's Dr. Catherine Hughes from Crime Psych. In this video, I'm going to be talking about an experiment that was conducted in 1973 and has long been included in textbooks and in schools, colleges and universities. I watched a fascinating film about it recently on Amazon Prime, and it gives a brilliant insight into what this experiment revealed. I definitely recommend watching it. I will put a link in the description box of this video for that. Zimbardo and his colleagues were interested in finding out whether the brutality that was reported amongst guards in American prisons was due to the sadistic personalities of the guards or had more to do with the prison environment. So him and his team designed an experiment which set up a mock prison at Stanford University. Part of the building was made into a prison with classrooms and offices converted into prison cells. They put out adverts offering money for students to take part in that study. 75 people volunteered, and each of them were assessed on their mental state, personality, criminal history and medical needs. 24 of those were then chosen to take part in the study, and then they were randomly assigned to be prison guards or prisoners. Prisoners were treated like every other criminal, being arrested in their own homes without warnings and taken to the local police station. They were then fingerprinted, photographed and booked. They were then blindfolded and driven to the psychology department of Stanford University, which, as I've said, was set out as a prison with barred doors and windows, bare cells and small cells. Once they arrived there, they were stripped naked, deloused, had all of their personal possessions removed and locked away, and were given prison clothes and bedding. They were issued with a uniform, and they were only referred to by their ID number. The use of the ID number was a way to make prisoners feel anonymous. Each prisoner could only be called by his ID number and could only refer to himself and the other prisoners by their numbers. By doing this, they were de-individualising the prisoners. The prisoners were given a smock with their ID number on, but were given no underwear. They wore caps on their hair and a chain around their ankle. The guards were given a khaki uniform, a whistle to put around their necks, and sunglasses so that they couldn't make eye contact with the prisoners. The guards worked different shifts, and they were instructed to do whatever they thought was necessary to maintain law and order in the prison and to command the respect of prisoners. No physical violence was allowed from them, though. Within a very short time, both the guards and the prisoners were settling into their new roles, with the guards adopting theirs very quickly and easily. Within hours of beginning the experiment, some guards began to harass the prisoners. At 2:30 a.m, prisoners were woken up by blasting whistles for the first of many counts, and these counts were a way to familiarise the prisoners with their numbers. More importantly, they provided a regular occasion for the guards to exercise control over the prisoners. The prisoners soon adopted prisoner-like behaviour too. They talked about prison issues and they told tales on each other to the guards. They started taking the prison rules very seriously. Some even began to side with their guards and told on those who didn't obey the rules. The prisoners were taunted with insults and with petty orders. They were given pointless and boring tasks to accomplish, and they were generally dehumanised. Push-ups were a common form of physical punishment that was imposed by the guards. One of the guards stepped on the prisoners' backs while they did push-ups, or they made other prisoners sit on the backs of fellow prisoners while they did their push-ups. The first day of the experiment went fairly smoothly. However, on the second day, the prisoners started a rebellion. The prisoners removed their stocking caps, they ripped off their numbers, and they barricaded themselves inside the cells by putting their beds up against the door. The guards then called for reinforcements. The 3 guards who were waiting on standby duty came in, and the night shift duty guards voluntarily remained on duty. The guards retaliated by using a fire extinguisher, and they forced the prisoners away from the doors with that. Next, the guards managed to break into the cell. They stripped the prisoners naked and took their beds out. The ringleaders of the prison rebellion were placed into solitary confinement, which was a small cupboard in the area. After this, the guards generally began to harass and intimidate the prisoners more. One of the 3 prison cells was designated as a privileged cell. The 3 prisoners who were least involved in the rebellion were given special privileges. The guards gave them back their uniforms and beds and allowed them to wash their hair and brush their teeth. Privileged prisoners also got access to eat special food in the presence of the other prisoners who weren't allowed those. And the effect was to break the solidarity among the prisoners. Over the next few days, the relationship between the guards and the prisoners changed, with a change in one leading to a change in the other. The guards were very firmly in control, and the prisoners were totally dependent on them. As the prisoners became more dependent, the guards became more scathing towards them. They held the prisoners in contempt, and they let the prisoners know it. As the guards' contempt for them grew, the prisoners became more submissive. As the prisoners became more submissive, the guards became more aggressive and assertive. They demanded even greater obedience from the prisoners. The prisoners were dependent on the guards for everything, and so they started to try to please them in any way that they could, such as telling tales on fellow prisoners. Less than 36 hours into the experiment, one of the prisoners began suffering from acute emotional disturbance. They had disorganised thinking, uncontrollable crying and rage. That prisoner met with the guards, but they told him that he was weak, but offered him informant status. He returned to the other prisoners and said, "You can't leave, you can't quit." Soon he began to act erratic and started to scream, curse, and he went into a rage that seemed out of control. At that point, the psychologist realised that they had to let that prisoner out. There were many more elements to that experiment, which you can read up on if you want to. I will include all of the references in the video description, or you can watch the film. It's quite an accurate portrayal. According to Zimbardo and his colleagues, the Stanford prison experiment revealed how people readily conform to social roles that they're expected to play, especially if the roles were as strongly stereotyped as that of the prison guards. He concluded that 2 factors were driving their behaviour: deindividualization and learned helplessness. Deindividualization is a state when you become so immersed in the norms of the group that you lose your sense of identity and personal responsibility. The guards may have been so sadistic because they didn't feel what happened was down to them personally. It was a group norm. They also might have lost their sense of personal identity because of the uniforms that they wore. Also, learned helplessness could explain the prisoners' submission to the guards. The prisoners learned that whatever they did had little effect on what happened to them. In the mock prison, the unpredictable decisions of the guards led the prisoners to give up responding, and that was termed learned helplessness. One of the major positive things that come about because of that study is that it altered the way that US prisons were run. For example, juveniles accused of federal crimes are no longer housed before their trial with adult prisoners because of the risk of violence towards them. Another strength of the study is that the harmful treatment of participants led to the formal recognition of ethical guidelines by the American Psychological Association. Studies must now undergo extensive review by an institutional review board in the US, or it's called an ethics committee in the UK, before any experiment can take place and is implemented. Psychologists today wouldn't be able to carry out this experiment in the same way because of ethical concerns. This study has been criticised by some who say that the findings can't be extended to real prison settings. The study has received many ethical criticisms, including the lack of fully informed consent by participants, because Zimbardo himself didn't know what would happen in the experiment, so it was unpredictable. Also, the prisoners didn't consent to them being arrested at home. The prisoners weren't told, partly because the final approval from the police wasn't given until minutes before the study started, and partly because the researchers wanted the arrest to come as a surprise. However, that was a breach of ethics of Zimbardo's own contract with them that all of the participants had signed. Participants playing the role of prisoners weren't protected from psychological harm and experienced incidents of humiliation and distress. But new interviews with the participants and reconsideration of the records are now shedding more light on the experiment, questioning a few of its bedrock assumptions about human behaviour. Perhaps one of the most significant ones is that one of the prisoners now says that his actions have been long misunderstood. The prisoner that had screamed and seemed to have an erratic rage episode now says that that episode was less of a psychotic break and more of a manipulation so that he could go home and study for a test. He said that he didn't scream because of the abusive guards, but because he was worried about not getting access to textbooks during his prison stay so that he could cram for his graduate examination. Looking back on the experience, he says that he actually enjoyed himself most of the time, including during the rebellion. He's reported to have said, "The rebellion was fun, there were no repercussions, we knew that the guards couldn't hurt us because they couldn't hit us. They were white college kids, just like us, so it was a very safe situation." He was, however, shocked by the fact that he couldn't leave of his own free will, remembering that the guards were really escalating their game by saying that they couldn't leave. He said they're stepping up to a new level, and it was just like, oh my God. One of the guards earned the nickname John Wayne because of his imaginative cruelty. He says that he saw the experiment as a kind of improv exercise and he wanted to be perfect by creating this despicable guard persona that he did. He's long maintained that he developed the cruel character after watching the movie Cool Hand Luke. He said that he tapped into his own experiences in a brutal fraternity hazing a few months earlier. Nearly half a century later, he recalls feeling like he'd done something good and accomplished something because he'd contributed in some way to the understanding of human nature. In 2011, interviews were published in the Stanford alumni magazine where the guard said, "I set out with a definite plan in mind to try to force the action, force something to happen so that the researchers would have something to work with. After all, what could they possibly learn from guys sitting around like it was a country club?" He claimed that he was running his own experiment within an experiment, each day trying to do something more outrageous than the day before. He often wondered how much abuse will these people take before they say, knock it off. And he said, but the other guards didn't stop him. They seemed to join in and they were taking his lead. Not a single guard, he says, said, "I don't think we should be doing this." Another guard told the alumni magazine that Zimbardo went out of his way to create tension with strategies like forced sleep deprivation. He says that Zimbardo knew what he wanted and then tried to shape the experiment by how it was constructed and how it was played out to fit the conclusion that he'd already worked out. He claimed that Zimbardo wanted to show that middle-class young people will turn on each other just because they're given a role and given power. But he said that the hypothesis that he'd come up with was a real stretch, and he's quoted to have said, "I don't think the actual events match up with the bold headline. I never did, and I haven't changed my opinion." In conclusion then, this study that has long been a staple in psychology textbooks was quite controversial. Zimbardo couldn't have anticipated that the participants would react and behave in the ways that they actually did. But the experiment has been criticised by some who've said that it's got no ecological validity, meaning that the same thing wouldn't happen in a real prison setting. I hope that you found this video interesting. More importantly, I hope that you've learned something new. Thanks for watching then. Bye for now.